the newly born lion cub Simba is lifted triumphantly over the crowd of gathered animals as a sudden shaft of light shines from out of the clouds like a spotlight on Simba in what is one of the most iconic images in film. The gathered animals bow. Simba appears to be the greatest, or at least the heir to an apparent animal monarchy. The Gospel of Mark tells us that the disciples were arguing about who among them was the greatest. But when Jesus asks about it, they are apparently too embarrassed to share this topic of conversation with him. Perhaps on some level they know that this jostling for hierarchical position is not what Jesus expects of them. But they persist on trying to understand themselves and their relationship to Jesus in these hierarchical terms. In response, Jesus places before them a child. Culturally, we tend to think of children as representing the future and potential, sometimes to their own detriment. I can't count how many times I've heard someone say that homophobia will be a thing of the past soon because look at how the kids talk about it, ignoring that any progress that has been made for queer rights has been hard-won and is tenuous, not some inevitability. Such apathy allows for the erosion of rights that threatens the well-being of children and adults today, including especially trans children, who are being legally denied medical care related to gender transition in several states right now, despite overwhelming evidence that denial of such care, when it is desired, has devastating impacts on mental and emotional well-being. Children should not be reduced to a symbol of progress, especially if that means ignoring the needs of children and other vulnerable people in the present. These associations with the future and progress are not how ancient readers and hearers would have understood a reference to a child or children. For them, a child would represent powerlessness and dependence. A child depends on caretakers to meet their needs, especially when very young, has limited autonomy, and in the world of first-century Palestine, lacked legal rights. Viewed in this way, the connection between Jesus' talking about welcoming the child as a way to welcome him and the argument the disciples have been having about who is the greatest begins to take form. By placing a child in front of them, Jesus is visually and symbolically representing putting someone who lacks power, independence, and autonomy as of foremost importance, reversing the commonly understood social hierarchy, which the disciples are trying to understand and assert their position within. Jesus reverses expectations, calling the entire social order and the markers of power and privilege into question. As the disciples argue about who is the greatest, Jesus makes clear that they are looking for closeness to God in the wrong places. It is not by being the greatest disciple that they will get closer to God, but by welcoming and recognizing God in the vulnerable and seemingly powerless. Jesus reminds the disciples also of what he told them in the gospel passage we heard last week, that he will suffer and die. They are confused, at least in part, because Jesus' prediction is a reversal of what they think a Messiah should be. Just as Jesus is not the kind of Messiah that leads a conquering force, overthrows the Roman occupation, or restores the political fortune of Israel, Jesus calls his disciples to a new way of life that privileges not the powerful, but the dependent. As Jesus lifts the child up, Perhaps in our mind's eye, we should imagine not the baby lion cub Simba lifted over his subjects, but instead picture all those who are dependent on the care of others. Think hungry and crying babies, elders no longer able to care for their own needs, and people needing specialized nursing care. Or those who are denied their rights to safety and adequate shelter, and whose personal agency is limited by forces far outside their own control, such as constantly displaced refugees in and from Gaza, and the unhoused with nowhere to go. Jesus tells us that when we welcome the powerless child, we welcome him and the one who sent him. Jesus is found in the face of a dependent child, a disabled elder, a refugee. When we welcome a stranger, we have the opportunity to meet Jesus, to see God's image in that person. As we say farewell to Betsy and wish her well in her move, we hope and pray that she will see the image of God in the people she moves to be among, and that they will welcome her and see God reflected in her as well. As the disciples argue who is greatest and try to find ways to lift themselves above each other, Jesus' words echo forward to us, calling us to know and remember that you won't get closer to God by being the best disciple or the best Christian, or by seeking power and influence, but you might find God when you get down low to tie the shoe of a child who cannot tie it themselves, or in conversation with someone who is unhoused, or doing a tedious and thankless task. We don't need to be lifted up like Simba to get close to God. God is right here, in a messy, broken world, in messy people, waiting to be welcomed and invited in.
Amen.